Hello and welcome. I'm Austin Adams, originally from Adelaide, but keen to take you on a historical walk around my new home of Kangaroo Point in inner Brisbane. This map shows our route and the many places mentioned. You could print it out and take the walk, or just sit back and enjoy the show. After many thousands of years' occupation by the Jagera, Yugarapul and Turrbal people, the white settler John Oxley arrived in the Brisbane River in 1823 on the lookout for an ultra-secure convict settlement. He described the Kangaroo Point area as jungle fringed with mangroves. Historians tell us the original vegetation was probably vine forests with thick grassy understory and tall trees. The name Kangaroo Point almost certainly came from the fact that the flats of what is now Captain Burke Park were used to corner mobs of kangaroos against the river in Aboriginal hunting drives. The first known European settlement at Kangaroo Point was in the early days of the penal colony in May 1825. Convicts planted the rich soil on the western side of the peninsula with maize, wheat and potatoes and guarded it from crows and cockatoos. As with much of the white encroachment in Australia, there was conflict with Indigenous inhabitants who strongly resented the incursion into their territory and would take or destroy what the settlers had planted. The name of Andrew Petrie, who quarried the much-desired Brisbane tuff or volcanic stone, we'll hear more about that later, lives on in Petrie Bight, the tightly curved river section immediately under the Story Bridge. In those early days, the land was cultivated by chained-up convicts, using just hoes, no plough. As the corn was ripening, a prisoner was put on guard to keep away the crows and the cockatoos, using a clapper to make a noise to frighten the birds. Constance Petrie, Andrew Petrie's daughter, tells us, "These crow minders were prisoners under short sentence who weren't chained like the others. One of these men had a hut built up in the fork of a gum tree on the bank of the river. This crow minder's gum tree had steps made of pieces of iron driven into the trunk. Constance Petrie tells us that a crow minder named Andy used to climb up to his hut and watch that the blacks didn't swim across from Kangaroo Point or come in a canoe to steal the corn or sweet potatoes. The blacks were very daring in those days," Constance Petrie tells us. "Andy had an old flint pistol which he fired off to give the alarm when the darkies appeared," she writes. This map, thank you Ray Kirkove, shows the 1829 location of cornfields. It shows the crow minders' huts and the routes of raids on the cornfields. These raids were deadly serious. The Indigenous groups had worked out that the tiny colony needed its crops and supply ships to survive, so they deliberately pulled up and burnt entire fields. The map shows some of the known raids and counter-raids. In the area bounded by Thorn Street, Shafton Avenue and Wellington Streets, there's nothing to see there now, we know that there was an early Aboriginal campsite. Its location is shown on the far right in this drawing. Aboriginal campsites were permanent sites, much like villages. This one was the location of several incidents as recorded in newspaper articles from the 1840s to 1870s. The adjacent Mowbray Park has been a corroboree and tournament area for this camp. This painting, The Camp of Shafton Avenue, is by Conrad Martins. Thanks again to Dr. Ray Kirkove. Ray has a book, by the way, entitled Aboriginal Campsites of Greater Brisbane that gives more detail. Back to Constance Petrie's story. She goes on to say her father told her, and I quote, "Once, when Kangaroo Point was under a crop of corn, the blacks were very troublesome. Nothing seemed to prevent them from stealing. So one was shot and skinned, then stuffed and put up amongst the corn to frighten the rest. It turned out a good cure. The corn wasn't troubled afterwards." Whether this was true or not, my father does not know, but he was told it as a fact many a time. That's from Constance Petrie's 1904 book, Tom Petrie's Reminiscences of Early Brisbane. After 1842, free settlers were permitted in Brisbane, with Kangaroo Point being one of the first settled areas. There were still many local Indigenous peoples in the area. An article in the Moreton Bay Courier of the 19th of June 1847 reports on a Kangaroo Point corroboree involving local Indigenous people as well as some from Amity Point on what is now South Stradbroke Island. The article concludes, and I quote, "As usual after their corroborees they had some severe fighting, and we are informed that Long Ned, an Amity Point black, got speared through the arm by a young kipper whose father he had killed about 12 months since." Here is an 1874 or so painting of early Kangaroo Point by J.C. Armitage. It's one of the earliest images we have of the area. After the Kangaroo Point area was surveyed in 1850, it soon developed into a bustling, thriving commercial town with foundries, sawmills, slipways and engineering works. There were pubs, bars and sly grog shops serving the needs of the many seamen and squatters who lived and worked in the area. A horse-drawn tram carried goods and people to and from Yungaba. For many Brisbane residents, the name Kangaroo Point conjures up images of the Storybridge Hotel. The hotel, originally called the Kangaroo Point Hotel, was built in 1886 for James Darragh using bricks brought as ship's ballast from Scotland. It replaced the early 1878 Logan Hotel. The hotel was renamed the Storybridge Hotel after completion of the bridge in 1940. The designer of the hotel was architect Richard Gailey, who designed many impressive buildings in Brisbane, including the Regatta Hotel in Toowong. During the threat of invasion in World War II, American servicemen built bomb shelters behind the hotel for possible use by workers at the nearby Evans Deakin shipyard. The area is now the Shelter Bar between the pylons of the Story Bridge. The hotel was used for accommodating Australian Navy personnel during the Second World War. Over the years, the hotel has changed hands and been altered several times. In 1967, Barry Deary and his wife Jessie purchased the hotel and made many renovations. The hotel is now owned by Barry and Jessie's son and daughter, Richard and Jane. It's one of the last remaining family-owned and operated hotels in Brisbane. Jane Deary herself grew up living in the hotel and nearby. Jane tells us she remembers riding a go-kart down Bright Street to the park below. Kangaroo Point was full of people, she says. There were so many workers that 2 ferries used to operate over to Edward Street City. When one pulled out, the other would pull in. When the ferry was full, they had to stop people getting on. People were packed in like sardines. The fare was 1 cent for a child, 2 cents for an adult. It was a great area to grow up in, says Jane. There was so much going on. Up Belden Street, on the corner of Deakin Street, is the well-known Tuppys coffee shop and convenience store. There used to be a house on this site which Don Sharp and his friend John McCoy rented. The house is shown in the red circle in this early photo. Don tells us that back then there were so many cockroaches in every Kangaroo Point building that someone had the idea to have cockroach races. That started the trend for the annual Australia Day Cockroach Race held by the Storybridge Hotel. But Jane Deary tells us the cockroach races started after someone from Hawthorn claimed that their cockroaches were much faster than the lazy Kangaroo Point ones. Opposite the Storybridge Hotel on the corner of Belden Street and Main Street is a heritage-listed building now housing a convenience store. It was built around 1878 using the same bricks as were used for the Storybridge Hotel, bricks that came out from the UK as ship's ballast. It's been a general store, a butcher and a grocery store, and most recently a real estate agent. Here's a 1955 photo of the building shown as we look down Main Street for comparison with a modern view. And here's a view of the early rear section showing the stairs now demolished. 2 people who have lived there in the past have given us insight into the times. Gordon Woolston, born in 1931, remembers living there above the shop his parents ran. My earliest memory, Gordon says, is of a very small room. It was just a tiny, closed-in balcony with a French door. I was locked in at night, which I hated. I spent a lot of time standing on my bed looking out into the street at night, wondering just what life had in store for me. Someone had mentioned a war, and I worried about the onset of a war. It was never something I mentioned to anybody. Years later, Kerry Geraghty's parents also ran a store there, a sandwich shop catering to all the local workers. Kerry tells us, "Mum did lunches for hundreds of painters and dockers and other local industries. The shop was a true corner store, well stocked with groceries and fresh fruit and vegetables delivered every few days. The sandwich business grew and grew. Mum did lunches for workers from Deakin, Pullen's Towing, Robb and Brown and Smash Repairs, Peter's Slip, to name just a few, all from the little kitchen on the premises." Thanks, Kerry, for that. Main Street, Kangaroo Point, used to be lined with early Queensland buildings but is now almost entirely apartment buildings. About 150 metres further down from the Owl is number 161 on the other side of the road. It's now an apartment building. Pat Thomas used to live in a flat there. Pat tells us she shared the downstairs flat with 3 other girls. There was another flat upstairs where other girls live. Pat wouldn't say, but she implied that some of the girls in the building were, shall we say, a bit loose, and were protected back then by police visitors. Kangaroo Point was an exciting place to live, said Pat, but it was quite seedy. If we walk down Bright Street, opposite the hotel, we come to the parks on the west side of Kangaroo Point Peninsula. C.T. White Park on the left and James Warner Park on the right. There are several historical plaques there you can read. James Alexander Warner, 1814 to 1891, was born in London. He joined the Navy and came to Sydney, where he became a surveyor. In 1839 he was sent to Moreton Bay, that was the original name for Brisbane, to survey and set out the streets. He settled in Kangaroo Point and in 1844 built the first European dwelling in the area near the park named after him. In early days there were wharves in the river in front of the park area. In the late 1800s a vehicular steam ferry operated from the end of Bright Street straight across to the end of Charlotte and Creek Streets in the city. The wharves were cleared away in the early 1930s, but there are some remnants visible there now at low tide. Cyril Tennyson White, the name given to the other park, came later. Here's a photo of C.T. White, and here's the sign locating the park. There's also a historic plaque there. C.T. White was born in 1890 in Kangaroo Point and lived in a substantial residence on Main Street near Silverwells, which we'll see a little later. He was a respected government botanist and writer of many books, specialising in the systematic classification of Queensland flora. The road running along the side of C.T. White and James Warner Parks is Hamilton Street. Gail Bishop lived at number 16 Hamilton Street and worked in the city for McDonald Hamilton Shipping, hence the names of McDonald and Hamilton Streets. As a kid, I grew up in Kangaroo Point knowing everyone, Gail says. It was such a lovely place. People used to ask us in for a drink and cakes. They used to bring horses and carts down Bright Street and drive them straight onto the ferry and go over to Creek Street. We used to play in the building sites and on the old boat, the Myora, wrecked down on the water's edge near the Jazz Club. The wreck is still there, you can see it at low tide. We used to skate around on the muddy back deck that sloped down into the water. We would walk around the point and under the bridge at the water's edge and get all muddy. Mum would hose us down before we were allowed into the house. Gail goes on, there was a plasterboard factory near the water's edge where the blocks of concrete are now. Those blocks were machine bases. The coconut fibre for making the plasterboard was dropped off in a pile. Before they used it, we used to get up speed running and jump into the pile. It was great fun. After a while it would stink and be awful, but when it was new, we would play in it and have so much fun. We used to play fox and hounds with pieces of the plasterboard. The son of the policeman up the road was part of our group with my 4 brothers and the boys next door, Peter and Anthony. Gail says, at the end of Main Street, now Captain Burke Park, there was a huge corrugated iron building. Dad told me they used to build engines there using 2 sections of rail. Clydesdale draft horses would move one rail section in front of the other to bring the engines up to the rail line that ran along the side of Stanley Street at Wollongabba. Thanks, Gail. What a lovely story. The building now used by the Brisbane Jazz Club is on land leased from the Queensland Government. The original building was an open-sided boathouse belonging to the South East Queensland Power Boat Company. In 1872, the building and lease were acquired by the Adventurers Club, which promoted jazz music, among other things. In 1985, the Brisbane Jazz Club bought the building and took over the lease. The Jazz Club has extensively improved the building, making it a great place for members and visitors to listen to the best of Queensland, interstate and overseas jazz. The deck on the riverside of the Jazz Club building has an interesting history. It's a concrete slab which slopes downward towards the river. The slab is partly formed on an old barge which the Adventurers Club bought from the state government. It was floated down, then over the mangroves to be adjacent to the building. Around that time, Deakin was leaving their shipbuilding site. They dumped loads of rubble to fill the riverside area. The deck was then built over the old barge and the fill. The deck's now an integral part of the club and gives superb river and city views. Next to the Jazz Club is the Holman Street ferry terminal, built prior to 1919. It's one of the few intact examples of a purpose-built ferry terminal that we have in Brisbane. Note the design and detail of the original timber waiting shed that you pass through on your way to the modern terminal. It's square with a terracotta tiled roof topped with 2 terracotta finials. There are arched openings to the street and the river. Inside are timber bench seats against the walls. Electric lighting was installed in 1919 when electric street lighting replaced gas throughout Kangaroo Point. Here's a view from the water of the terminal before its recent update. Near the Holman Street ferry terminal, in the park, is a stone with a plaque commemorating 150 years since the arrival of the Reverend Dr. J.D. Lang's 3 immigrant ships. There's a fascinating history to the event you can look up online. The entire pointy end of Kangaroo Point is now given over to Captain Burke Park, popular for picnics, barbecues, family get-togethers and the occasional grand event. Here's an image from around 1868. It's said that in 1862 the young John Burke, with his Irish sweetheart, jumped ship in Brisbane with a bottle of rum, a stick of tobacco and 6pence in his pocket. In 1887, he founded what became the well-known John Burke Shipping Company. Details are on the information board facing Holman Street, opposite the end of Main Street. In 1887, well before the area became Captain Burke Park, the Queensland Government decided to build railway locomotives rather than import them from England or the United States. Between 1890 and 1927, many steam locomotives were built in the engineering works of Evans, Anderson and Phelan, which occupied much of what is now Captain Burke Park. You can see the company's name on their roof in this photo. The locomotives were delivered in pairs, steaming along Main Street on panels of prefabricated track, which were dragged from behind by draft horses and then placed in front of the engines for the next section of the slow journey. The 2.4 kilometres from the tip of Kangaroo Point to the Yungaba railway yards took about 3 days. Roughly in the centre of the park now is a 5-metre tall 4-sided concrete sculpture entitled The Rock by Stephen Killick. It was commissioned for the 1988 World Expo held in Brisbane. In 1989 it was relocated here as permanent artwork. According to the artist, the images are comments on greed, political deception, consumerism, war and innocence. Near the edge of the park, roughly opposite the end of Main Street, is a large stone with a plaque commemorating the completion of the Clem 7 tunnel in 2010, Brisbane's first cross-river tunnel, which is immediately below the stone. Near this stone on Holman Street is a panel with details of John Burke and his company. At the eastern end of Holman Street, in the park, is a memorial to the Vietnamese boat people of the late 1970s. Now for the Story Bridge itself. After the completion of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1932, the Queensland Government accepted Dr. J.J. Bradfield's design for a bridge of 4 or 6 lanes to cross the Brisbane River at Kangaroo Point. The design is based on the early Jacques Cartier Bridge across the St. Lawrence River in Montreal, Quebec. It's shown here. The similarities are clear, but note how the central span of the Cartier Bridge follows the curve, whereas ours is flat. Unlike the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which was fabricated in the UK, the steelwork for our Story Bridge was fabricated at the Evans Deakin Rockley Works, with construction by Evans Deakin Hornibrook. It took 5 years to build and cost $3.2 million, that is. The original brief called for 4 or 6 lanes. Since the quote for 6 lanes was only $50,000 more, it was, very luckily for us now, the one accepted. At the time, it was a considerable engineering feat, based on much research carried out by the Canadians after they had 2 bridge failures with much loss of life. As part of the Canadian collaboration, the 8 wedge mechanisms used to join the 2 halves of the central suspended span were brought out from Canada and used on the Story Bridge in the joining operation. During the economic depression of the 1930s, the bridge's construction boosted the local economy. From 1935 to 1940, it employed some 400 construction workers. Michael Moy's excellent short book summarises the construction. Engineering Heritage Australia also has a very informative pamphlet. The bridge was originally known as the Jubilee Bridge during construction, honouring King George V, but when it was opened in 1940, it was named after J.D. Story, the Public Service Commissioner and a member of the Bridge Board. It was a toll bridge until 1947, when the bridge was transferred to the Brisbane City Council and the toll removed. If you're adventurous, you can climb to the top of the Story Bridge with tours conducted by the Story Bridge Adventure Climb on Main Street. Each night the bridge is illuminated with different colours, perhaps to mark a special day in history, or to raise awareness for a charity, or even to showcase some upcoming event. The Brisbane City Council's website gives the key to the meaning of each night's illumination. You can look it up. Holman Street, particularly near Anderson Street, is the site of the most famous murder in Brisbane. On March the 27th, 1848, the carefully butchered body parts of Robert Cox were found in separate places near here. The head was found, still bleeding, propped up so it would look at whoever found it. Late on the 26th of March, 2 days beforehand, drinkers at the Bush Inn on the corner of Holman Street and Main Streets included one Robert Cox, a timber getter, and several slaughtermen, including Patrick Mayne. Cox, who was known to have just been paid a large sum for some cedar wood, was murdered that night and the money wasn't found. Was it a coincidence that a year later, Patrick Mayne paid the same amount as was stolen from Cox, the equivalent of several years' wages, to purchase a Queen Street property? Mayne became one of the richest men in the colony. Patrick Mayne, on his deathbed in 1865, confessed to the murder. His family, in rehabilitating their name, left a considerable legacy to the University of Queensland. There's a main hall there too, now an art gallery. It was all a very sad tale, particularly for the prime suspect, the hotel cook, William Fife, who was said to have had a homosexual relationship with Cox. Fife was sent to trial in Sydney on flimsy evidence. He was found guilty and hanged. The full story of that incident is written up in the book The Mayne Inheritance by Rosamond Seaman. Let's move on to more pleasant things. The majestic colonial building at 110 Main Street, Yungaba, occupies the block through to the river. This is the west side grand entrance. The east side faces the river. Here we have Yungaba as it was originally, and Yungaba on the riverside now. The site on which Yungaba is built was that of Kangaroo Point's first industrial undertaking, John Tinker Campbell's boiling down and salting works of the 1840s. The smell was the subject of many complaints, as you can imagine. Yungaba, the name of the building there now, means place in the sun in the language of the original inhabitants of Kangaroo Point. The building is an Italianate mansion constructed by the government between 1885 and 1889 to provide immigrants with temporary accommodation before moving into the community. It was Brisbane's equivalent of New York's Ellis Island and was used for over a century to process new arrivals to the colony of Queensland. During the Boer War and the two World Wars, the Yungaba complex was used as a wartime hospital and as a reception area for returning soldiers. It has doubled as a refuge for the destitute and homeless. From 1902 to 1906, a centre for the rehabilitation of South Sea Islanders. During the construction of the Story Bridge from 1934 to 40, it was used as the engineer's office and operational headquarters. In more recent times, Yungaba has housed many different organisations, such as the Brisbane Ethnic Music and Arts Centre, BMAC, the Australian Volunteers International, and Austcare. It's also been a popular venue for conventions, conferences, and functions. The best view of Yungaba is from the boardwalk on the eastern side of Kangaroo Point, easily accessible from the east end of Holman Street. The Medley Riverfront Cafe to the south of Yungaba is part of the Yungaba complex. It has on its veranda wall an excellent pictorial history of Yungaba. In 2009, the state government sold the entire Yungaba property to a developer for residential development. The exterior of the heritage-listed building and its gardens have been preserved, and uninterrupted views of the building from the river are retained. We understand that one of the conditions of the sale was that the building should be open to the public for 2 days of the year for historical inspections. As part of the conditions of sale, the developer built a multicultural centre at 102 Main Street for use by a variety of multicultural organisations. The rest of the site has medium-density residential apartments. As you look at all the modern development around Yungaba, bear in mind that photos taken as late as 1980 show many modern buildings in the city, but absolutely none in Kangaroo Point, only industrial enterprises, many of which serviced the busy local river traffic. From Yungaba, let's walk a further 100 metres south along the river frontage, past the cafe and past the first apartment building. On the first set of steps into the complex on the right is a marker showing the height of the 2011 flood. Past the second apartment building, on the site of the third apartment building, was Peter's Slip. As Brisbane developed in the mid-1980s, an increasing number of small ships was required to service the everyday life of the river. Steam and smoke became an integral part of local life. It was soon necessary to provide facilities to keep the vessels in a seaworthy condition. Kangaroo Point became the centre of Brisbane's ship repair and maintenance industry, with a number of slips on the eastern side of Kangaroo Point. Anderson's Slipway began commercial life with the launching of the steam yacht Emma in 1865. Alexander Peters then founded Peters Slip on the same site in 1873. This was the oldest slipway in Brisbane when it closed in 1989, still using the same steam engines that were installed when the company was founded. Peters Slip accommodated all types of trading craft, sailing ships, steamers and modern diesel vessels up to 1,000 tonnes. Peters Slip even had a soccer club and tennis court. Yvonne Crossley, born Yvonne Peters, tells us this. My grandfather, Alexander Peters, was a sailor who came out from Scotland in 1854. He jumped ship and went to work on a slip at Kangaroo Point. He bought it and turned it into Peters Slip. My dad was Robert Peters. He died in 1952. The building at the bottom of Rotherham Street was Horn Engineering. Our slip was next to it. I was born in 1934 in a house towards the bottom of Wharf Street. Mum never got to the hospital. Wharf Street then went down to the river. We had 2 tennis courts next to the water, then there was our house. I was the youngest of 5. I wasn't allowed into the workshop when they were working, but I used to play on the logs that were delivered to turn into wood for the furniture or whatever else was needed. The trucks with the logs came down Wharf Street and dropped them at the end. We had a mill there with bandsaws to cut up the wood. The mill was at the bottom level, then on top was the joiner's shop where they made all the ship's furniture and fittings. We didn't build ships. That was Evans Deakin down the road. When the ships were launched, they were towed to our wharves. That was where we did the fitting out. The slip was for cleaning the bottom of ships. I used to go to school, Yvonne went on to say, at the Kangaroo Point Primary School on top of the cliffs, where the park is now, next to St Mary's Church. We would climb over the wall near Ferry Street onto the bridge approach, then cross it to the other side. That was even before the bridge was joined. Down at the water's edge, the older ones would jump in and swim in the river. I wasn't allowed, but I did put prawn nets in to catch prawns. What a great story from Yvonne, the granddaughter of the founder of Peter's Slip. Heading south along the waterfront, we turned right into Rotherham Street. Note the anchor and plaque commemorating the Frank Nicklin Dock. The Nicklin Dock wasn't there, but a good 500 metres south. We'll see it in a short while. A few steps up Rotherham Street, we come to the first intersection, Goodwin Street. On the southwest corner of Rotherham and Goodwin Streets was the Sears and Gunn Proprietary Limited premises. Ken Wilkes used to work there. I was in Cairns, said Ken, when I got the job at Sears and Gunn in 1983. My fiancée and I moved to a place in Coorparoo, and the next day I started work as a process worker, making plumbing fittings at Sears and Gunn in Kangaroo Point. We made all the plumbing fittings that go behind the wall. We made them by hand, each fabricated with an oxyacetylene torch. I worked there for a good 10 years before Sears and Gunn were taken over by Kembler and we moved to Eagle Farm. There was a foundry at the back where we made gratings and the aluminium steps that go down manholes. Opposite us on Rotherham Street was Horn Engineering, who did stuff for Peter's Slip behind them. At Sears and Gunn, I usually took my own lunch to work, but sometimes we bought sandwiches from the place on the corner of Main Street and Belden Street opposite the hotel. There was a lovely lady there. Thanks, Ken. I think Ken was speaking of Kerry Geraghty and her parents' shop, where the Owl convenience store is now. Next to Sears and Gunn, and occupying areas through to Darra Street, were successively two major enterprises. First, Buzacott's, then Robb and Brown. In 1941, the Buzacott Machinery Factory opened there to make gates and fences, but by 1957, Buzacott's were assembling cars. Sir Lawrence Hartnett, the man credited with the success of Holden's in Adelaide, arranged for Buzacott's to assemble the German Borgwood cars, which he named the Lloyd Hartnett Alexander 600. At the rate of 6 cars a day, only some 1,500 Lloyd Hartnetts were produced before the company ceased production. The first of the cars produced was given in 1957 as a gift to prominent nurse educator Joan Godfrey. Norm Clapham and his wife Kathleen, now of Lismore, have been proud owners of a Lloyd Hartnett. Norm has sent us this photo of a restored Lloyd Hartnett. This is just like the one I purchased from Ted Thompson's garage in North Lismore in late 1957, he says. Mine was the first to be sold in the Northern Rivers area and was assembled by Buzacott's in Kangaroo Point. We clocked up 68,000 miles in it with only one replaced rear engine mount and one fan belt. Except for minor repairs, it was all original when we sold it. By the early 1970s, the Goodwin Street site was occupied by Robb and Brown Limited, where Gary Faulkner did his apprenticeship. Gary tells us, from 1974 to 1978, I was an apprentice glazier fitter at Robb and Brown in Goodwin Street. They had 3 buildings there occupying the whole western side of the street except for Sears and Gunn on the Rotherham Street corner. I lived in Hawthorne and was picked up to get to work by my brother's mate, who worked as a panel beater around the corner near the hotel. Sometimes I rode a push bike until I got my driver's license in 1977. One of us used to get all the smoko orders from everyone and take them to the shop on Rotherham Street. It wasn't a shop, more of a temporary cafeteria. One of my first jobs as an apprentice was to help clean up people's houses after the 1974 flood. Robb and Brown supplied glass to buildings from the small domestic to skyscrapers. They supplied all the bronze glass for number 10 Eagle Street building. They made kitchens too. Thank you, Gary, for that. Moving along to Darra Street, we have some notes from Joyce Guttormson, who lived at 83 Darra Street in the second house up from the waterfront. This photo, taken from the bridge, shows Joyce's house circled in red. Darra Street used to go through to the waterfront, but there was a laneway between Joyce's place and what she describes as the lovely old Queenslander on the waterfront. Joyce tells us that down the laneway they used to carry steel plates and bits and pieces between the two shipyards, one in Darra Street and the other in Ferry Street. We never had a car, says Joyce, as we were only a bus ride or ferry trip from Fortitude Valley to the city. I remember we caught mud crabs and fish in the Brisbane River down the bottom of our street, and we built a big guy for Guy Fawkes Day. The whole street was involved in the effort, and a great night was had by all. Thanks, Joyce. I am the same age as Joyce, born in 1942. I too can remember making a guy for Cracker Night. We used to scrounge old clothes to stuff it. Great fun. Continuing through to the town square section of the Dockside development, Ferry Street is on the right. Ferry Street used to continue down to the river. Patsy Granville lived at 85 Ferry Street, and she tells us this. Mum and Dad, Frank and Phoebe O'Shea, moved into 85 Ferry Street after they were married in 1926. I was born in 1928. My parents ran a shop for a few years on Main Street, not far from Ferry Street. And then Dad had a fruit business doing home deliveries by horse and cart. He kept his horse in the paddock behind the house. He also dug an air raid shelter there during the war. We were very close to the river where we played a lot as kids. At times there was a lot of noise all night long from the riveting at the shipyards. It was always exciting to watch the launch of a ship. I went to St. Joseph's School, and my brothers and I used to walk there every day. I was also in the church choir and used to go there on my scooter. One day a friend asked us for a ride home. She was behind me on the scooter. As we came down Main Street, she accidentally put on the foot brake and we both went flying. I ripped my new choir dress and Mum was very upset. Mum and Dad left Kangaroo Point in the 1960s when the house was demolished as part of the Evans-Deakin expansion. This photo of me was taken in front of the house in Ferry Street. The motorbike was my husband Lewin's ex-US Army Harley. They could be bought for a song after the war. Lewin added a sidecar that I rode in and he called it Patsy 2, T-O-O, because my nickname is Patsy. The next street along is Prospect Street, off Deakin Street. It can't be seen from the town square section of Dockside, as it's now much shorter than it was. It used to come off Main Street and cut across what is now Town Square to lead into the Evans-Deakin yard adjacent to the dock. Mal Shield and his sister Amanda lived at number 58 Prospect Street. Here are some photos from them. They tell us, from 1949, 58 Prospect Street was our childhood home. The houses in the street were mostly weatherboard workers' cottages whose verandas bordered the tarred footpath. Being at the end of the street, our house shared a fence with the Evans-Deakin shipyard. Our abiding memory of living there is of shipyard activity. The noise of the rivet guns and other machinery was continuous from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. apart from lunch breaks. But ship launches were exciting times. The yards then opened for exploration in ways that would never meet today's safety standards. The final hours before a launch were punctuated by the resounding thumps from knocking out the chocks that stabilised the ship on the slipway. Launches always occurred at high tide, and if that was early in the day, the thumps started in the pre-dawn hours. Despite the noise, living near the shipyard and the river was an absolute adventure playground for us and all the neighbourhood kids. In 1961, our house was resumed for the expansion of the shipyard. Thanks, Mel and Amanda. If we continue through Town Square, turn left in front of the dock and walk down to the end, we'll be at the Dockside Ferry Terminal. From this terminal, and from others in Kangaroo Point, ferries have been an important part of Kangaroo Point life. Here's the terminal before the last floods. Laurie Cordingley, who recently retired as a ferrymaster after 50 years, tells us this. My first runs from Kangaroo Point were during Expo 88, when two of my colleagues and I were chosen to man the ferry running from Edward Street and Thornton Street to the Expo. It was a great time, and we were all somewhat saddened when it was over. In 1990, the ferry from Dockside to Riverside Centre began operating. I took the first ferry out of Dockside at 8 a.m. on the 8th of December 1990. The fare to Riverside was $1 and I made a grand total of $8 for the shift. Of course, patronage went up as more Dockside apartments were sold and other Kangaroo Point residents became aware of the new service. All up, it was a fabulous time and always full of interest, whether it was from the passengers or the ever-changing views. Thanks, Laurie, for that story. I, myself, can remember meeting Laurie when he often captained one of the old wooden ferries. He always remembered my name. A great guy. The Dockside dry dock is now all that remains of the former Deakin shipyard. The dock was opened on the 21st of July 1967 by the then Premier Frank Nicklin and named the Frank Nicklin Dry Dock, hence that plaque at the end of Rotherham Street, the one on the anchor. The dry dock was originally almost 250 metres long, 35 metres wide and 6 metres deep, and could handle ships of up to 60,000 tonnes. The remains of the gate operating mechanism are visible at the river end. Near the ferry terminal are steps up to the Dockside lookout, giving a good view over it all. When World War II came in 1939, Deakin Industries, then a large-scale engineering company, changed over completely to wartime construction, shipbuilding. They developed a dry dock at what had been, from 1881, Moores Slip. That's spelt M-O-A-R, Moores Slip. This shows the Moores' home in Cairn Street. The adjacent area along the Brisbane River was further developed between 1964 and 1967 into extensive shipbuilding facilities. The first vessel, the 57-metre oil-fuel lighter Rockley, was completed in 1941 for the Royal Australian Navy. Many warships were built at the dock, including minesweepers, floating docks, oil lighters and merchant ships. After the war, a range of vessels was built there, including steamers, barges, colliers, cargo ships, tugs, trawlers, a vehicular ferry, bulk carriers, patrol boats and tankers. In 1973, the oil tanker Robert Miller at 67,000 tonnes, one of the largest ships built in Australia, was built at the dry dock. It was launched in September of that year. In the devastating floods on Australia Day 1974, the Robert Miller broke loose from the Deakin fit-out berth on the river. It had been manoeuvred from the dock and was at the mercy of the torrent raging down the river. Amazingly, the huge ship snagged itself by its anchors on the large slipway at Peter's Slip, avoiding a potential major disaster. The granddaughter of Arthur Deakin, Jane Deakin, remembers the early days. The earliest I can remember, says Jane, about the area is driving across the Story Bridge and my mother saying to us, "Your grandfather built this bridge." We didn't think too much of that, but then she pointed down to the left side and said, "And that's where they built the ships." In those days you could see the shipyard and all the buildings. They had the name on some of the taller structures and the big cranes. Evans, Deakin and Company. That seemed much more real to my brother and sister and me. We could read our own names high up on the cranes, and that was impressive. As my grandfather didn't have a partner, my mother was asked to help organise the ship launching events. She would plan the afternoon tea, greet the guests, and look very glamorous. As 4 to 8-year-olds, my brother and I would occasionally be taken to the shipyard to watch the event. Our spot was up a long flight of stairs to the shipyard office overlooking the launch area. Sometimes we would be taken down to the dock area to see the activity up close. I can remember seeing the huge chains that held the ship back. As the ship was launched, those enormous chains played out to hold the ship in the river. They were massive and made an incredible noise like the loudest thunder. It was very scary. Thanks, Jane. That must have been a very special childhood. At the inland end of the dry dock is the modern Ferryman's Bridge leading to Cairn Street. On the other side of Cairn Street, on the right, are the Cairn Street cottages, 3 identical small workers' cottages and a larger one on the corner of Lambert Street. Here they are now. The larger house was built in about 1876 by John Mullen. It's been moved a bit to allow for the development of the site. The 3 smaller cottages were built in 1885 as rental properties during a housing boom. The cottages are a unique example of the type of housing originally located in the area. All remained on one title deed but passed through various owners and at times rented out to workers at the shipyard. In 1979, By then badly run down, the cottages were bought by Clive Chatwood, an electrician working at the Deakin shipyard. He painstakingly restored them and subdivided the land. His foresight allows us to appreciate a historic link with the colonial heritage of Kangaroo Point. The adjoining small car park facing Shaftesbury Avenue is named in his honour. On the opposite corner of Lambert Street is Dunholm, built around 1876 to 1878 for John Gibbons in the style of the time and originally on a much larger site. Gibbons was a pardoned convict who became a successful ferryman and merchant. The house was sold by his descendants in 1903. A large extension was added to the rear in a major renovation around that time. If we turn up Lambert Street and cross the roundabout at O'Connell Street, we'll pass two heritage-listed houses. This is the first, the quaint Alpha Cottage, 1882 to 1883, on a corner at 127 Lambert Street. And this is Thorncliffe, the elegant colonial house on the corner of Castlebar Street at number 162. Both houses are on land originally owned by Henry Stuart Russell, Queensland explorer, squatter and writer of Queensland history. It was he who completed the grand Shaftesbury House. All were constructed during the housing boom of the 1880s. Crossing Castlebar Street and turning left, we can see the gated entrance to Shaftesbury House. Shaftesbury House is a magnificent Victorian Gothic-style building at the top of a large terraced lawn on the banks of the Brisbane River. At 23 Castlebar Street, we're looking at the back entrance. Built in the 1880s, it's probably the third oldest house in the Brisbane metropolitan area after Newstead House in 1846 and Bulimba House in 1849-50. It's a significant example of the work of two important Queensland architects, FDG Stanley and R.S. Dodds. The land was first acquired by the Reverend Robert Cox, 1851, who began building a single-storey house. In 1852, Darling Downs pastoralist politician Henry Russell purchased the property and completed the house in its Gothic form. He named it Shaftesbury after his wife's birthplace in Jamaica. After changing hands several times, the property was acquired in 1919 by the Commonwealth Government and converted into the Anzac Hostel for the care and treatment of totally and permanently incapacitated ex-servicemen. It served as a repatriation hospital until 1969. From then to 1987, it was occupied by the Royal Australian Air Force. After 1995, it was redeveloped as part of the current Shaftesbury International College. The main entrance is in Thorn Street, but is best viewed from the river. If we walk down Castlebar Street to Shaftesbury Avenue, turn right and walk to O'Connell Street, there's a modern building on the O'Connell Street corner, the Story Apartments. In the foyer is a tribute to Colonel Daniel Evans, who was the Evans of Evans Deakin. On the site of this apartment building was Chiselhurst, one of 5 houses forming the University of Queensland's Women's College from 1914 until the college moved to St Lucia in 1958. Notable alumni included Penelope Wensley, Anna Maria Bligh and Sally Ann Atkinson. Dorothea Wilkinson was an alumna of Chiselhurst for 3 years from 1944. She studied physiotherapy. Dorothea tells us that the college, consisting of 5 rather old houses, was run under the kindly guardianship of Anna Frederica Bage, the founding principal. Miss Bage was universally known as Frida, even by the residents of the nearby men's colleges. Other university colleges at Kangaroo Point were St John's and King's on River Terrace. Dorothea tells us that in the front garden of Chiselhurst was the college mascot, a small stone faun known as Eeyore, carved by the sculptor Leonard Chilham. Many a foray was made at night by residents of the men's colleges in attempts to abduct Eeyore, but none in Dorothea's time was successful. In those days, a few university students boarded at nearby Leckhampton. They joined college students in the walk to the Thornton Street ferry and then across the Botanic Gardens to the university, which was then in George Street in the city. Leckhampton is a beautiful example of a late 19th century city residence. Designed by noted architect Alexander Wilson, it was built in 1889 to 1890 for Charles Snow, a prominent city jeweller and founder of the Boy Scouts in Queensland. After his death in 1913, the house remained in the Snow family until 1924. It was then sold for conversion into flats. In 1984, the interior was converted into office accommodation. We can now cross Main Street on the pedestrian overpass and enter Kangaroo Point Cliffs Park. The site of Kangaroo Point Cliffs Park has a long educational heritage. The Kangaroo Point School opened there as a Church of England school in 1861. It came under the control of the Board of Education in 1867, consisting of a boys' and girls' department. An infant school was added in 1874. The separate boys', girls' and infant schools amalgamated in 1950 to become the Kangaroo Point State School and operated until 1965. From 1965 to 2009, it was the site of the Kangaroo Point TAFE, shown here. In 2007, the Kangaroo Point TAFE amalgamated with the South Bank Institute of TAFE, and the old buildings were demolished in 2009. The site was then redeveloped and opened in March 2010 as the Kangaroo Point Cliffs Park to give residents and visitors a place to enjoy a park and views of the city. Artworks in the park include the magnificent sculpture Venus Rising by British architect Wolfgang Buttress. At the northern end of the park is an entrance to St Mary's Church. Near the gate to the church is a memorial to Canon David Garland, the architect of Anzac Day. St Mary's Church is significant as it has always been the naval chapel in Queensland and was connected to the naval stores by timber stairs. Originally, the church was patronised by various governors when they resided at Old Government House. The church's pipe organ is the oldest in Queensland, dating from the early 19th century. It was imported from a London church in 1876. Here are some views of St Mary's. The parish hall was built in 1879, and the rectory, designed by architect John Buckeridge, was completed in 1889. An interesting art-related snippet is that from November 1955, the artist John Mulvig had his studio beneath St Mary's Church Hall. Here are two works by Mulvig from his Kangaroo Point studio. This one is entitled Sketch for Madam Y, and this one is entitled The Women. The photos are from a display of his work at the Queensland Art Gallery. Kangaroo Point was then well known for its brothels, an ongoing legacy of World War II when American troops were stationed in Brisbane. Let's now go back to Kangaroo Point Cliffs Park and go all the way to the far end, just past the cafe, where we find steps, over 100 of them, down to the waterfront. Before going down the steps, just look to the left. There's a plaque in memory of Lester Towerton, a fireman who lost his life here fighting a fire. Here are the steps and the present-day cliffs at the bottom. Although now much altered by the quarrying since convict times, the distinctive cliffs of Kangaroo Point were revered by Aboriginal peoples as relics of the titanic meanderings of the dreaming ancestor, an eel or serpent, as it gouged out the course of the Brisbane River. Rock engravings were said to have been seen along the cliffs. The rock of the Kangaroo Point Cliffs dates from the Triassic period 200 million years ago, but the present cliff face was only created during the early years of the colony when the rock was quarried by convict labour. The rock is a volcanic tuff, Tuff, with distinctive pink and green colouring. For a period of 150 years from the 1820s, the stone was used for many Brisbane buildings, roadworks, wharves and marine walls. Two significant examples are the Commissariat Store, 1828 to 29, in the city, and its William Street retaining wall, and the 1848 to 50 chapel in the grounds of St Stephen's Cathedral in Elizabeth Street. The external walls of St John's Cathedral, too, are in Brisbane Tuff. By 1976, most of the available Kangaroo Point rock had been extracted and the quarry was closed. The area was redeveloped as public park reserves with picnic areas, barbecue facilities, sculptures, riverside walkway and a bicycle path. The cliffs are now popular for abseiling and rock climbing. If we turn right at the base of the steps, we'll pass some sculptures which were moved here after the Brisbane Expo in 1988. This is Christopher Trotter's 1995 fish fossil. We're now at the River Life facility in what were previously the naval stores. Note the Brisbane Tuff wall. In the middle of the 19th century, hostilities in Europe caused the Australian colonies to realise they needed to provide for their own defence. Queensland was then independent of Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. There was an attempt to develop a combined colonies defence force, but this didn't eventuate, so each colony developed its own. The Brisbane defences included buildings to house naval stores and to provide for maintenance and training. These were constructed in 1886 to 1887 at this Kangaroo Point Naval Stores site and included two two-storey buildings, workshops for ships' repair, a wharf and a slipway. Here's a photo of the original naval stores showing the steps up to St Mary's Church. The stores now as River Life. The building that remains retains some of the original features. There's a hatch in the upper level through which torpedoes were raised and lowered. Tracks used by the gun trolleys can be seen, as can the raised concrete gun locations. On the right-hand wall are flood indicators showing the height of the 1893 and 1974 river floods. A notable event took place here on the 9th of April 1903. It was Australia's first ship-to-shore wireless transmission from HMQS Gayndah, moored near Moreton Island, to a receiving station in a shed near here. If we continue 400 metres north, we come to the Thornton Street ferry terminal, now no longer used. Here's an old view down Thornton Street, then called Pixley Street. Here's the terminal when up until quite recently it was functioning. In the 1860s, ferries and boats of all types were the only means of cross-river transport. One of these was a ferry service between Thornton Street and Edward Street in the city. The terminal and street were named after William Thornton, 1817 to 1884, an Irish immigrant who became a highly respected resident of Kangaroo Point. He was the collector of customs, the first water police magistrate for Moreton Bay and a member of the Legislative Council. In 1851 he erected the first prefabricated building in Queensland. He had his own boat for the daily trip across to Customs House. If we walk up the steps behind the ferry terminal, the corner of Pixley and Thornton Street, the approximate location of the Crowminder's hut, shown on the map at the beginning of this story. Further up on the corner of Main Street, where the present Bridgeport Apartments building stands, was the family home of Diane Smith. Diane Smith tells us this: "My family home for 25 years was at 311 Main Street, now the Bridgeport Apartments building. You can see it in the photo and drawing done by a family friend. My father and his father were bookmakers. Shortly after World War II, my grandfather, Jack Ellis, purchased the property from John Hetherington, who was a mayor of Brisbane early last century. My grandfather undertook extensive renovations to what was a large Queenslander-style home on the corner of Main and Thornton Streets. He raised the original home and built 4 flats underneath. Main Street was a busy 6-lane thoroughfare at that time, although not as busy it is now. There were traffic lights and a pedestrian crossing just down from my family home, which facilitated access to the strip of small businesses on the opposite side of Main Street. As a young child, I could look across the river to the city from our back door. The City Hall and the MLC building were the only buildings of any height at the time." Well, Diane, many thanks for that story. Now to the lockup. On the corner of Main and Thornton Streets is the original Kangaroo Point lockup. In 1872, tenders were called for the construction of a police lockup at Kangaroo Point. This was in response to a request by the local constable who didn't have a secure building in which to lock up drunkards who wandered the streets at night, annoying local residents. The tender was awarded to John Petrie and revised to include living accommodation for the constable. The present structure, built in 1910, includes cell doors from the original 1872 lockup. In 1928, the old station was demolished and a new reinforced concrete structure was erected, but the cell block remained intact and from 1928 was used for storage. The new station was occupied in 1929 and continued in service until 1964. This tiny timber-framed building contains 2 small cells with a veranda to one side. It's clad in weatherboards and has a corrugated iron gable roof which extends over the veranda. The heavy tongue-and-grooved timber doors of the cells still have their original bolts and peepholes. The police districts were redefined in 1964 and the Kangaroo Point station was no longer required. its duties were absorbed by the Yungaba station. The building continued in use only as a residence for the local constables until 1967, when the station and residence demolished to make way for the Story Bridge Expressway. But the cell block was never removed from the site. In 1993, the historic Kangaroo Point police station site was sold to Robin Spencer, architect, who bought the police lockup and now uses it as his reception area. Robin tells us this: "After I bought the lockup premises in 1994, we moved it about 15 metres forward to its present location. It's a magnificent structure. All the boards are a good 25 millimetres thick, grooved on their edges, with a 40 millimetre or so steel tongue inserted so the boards can't be prized off. The corners of the cells are reinforced too. When we shifted the building, we couldn't work out why it was so heavy, but it was because of all the steel in it. The building was a standard Department of Works design. We think the doors came off a jail built in around 1870 by Andrew Petrie. The hinges and locks are all hand-forged. We had to put a new roof on the building because the old roof was rotten. The lockup probably had a good bit of use as an overnighter for local drunks. Soon after we moved here, I was down getting a ferry one day and an ancient lady spoke to me. 'I've been here more than 50 years, she said. Before the ferry, there used to be blokes rowing people across the river. They wouldn't pick up anyone after dark because it was such a rough area, but I used to whistle for them. They knew my whistle and would always pick me up.' A short way along Main Street, turning left down Scott Street, we come to what are known as the Scott Street Flats, a 2-storey brick, timber and fibro building built in 1925 for Professor Frank and Mrs. Zena Cumbray Stewart. The building demonstrates the post-World War I residential development of Brisbane when flats appeared in inner-city suburbs. It's an example of an early purpose-built complex in the Tudor revival style and contains 2 identical flats and a maid's room. The building was designed by Elena Mottram, the first woman to open her own architectural practice in Brisbane and Queensland's longest practising female architect. The flats were entered into the Queensland Heritage Register in 2003, representing one of only 2 remaining intact examples of Elena Mottram's work. Further away on the far left, now raised and moved, is the former Water Police residence, part of the Kangaroo Point Police Reserve that stretched from the river to Main Street on the northern side of Thornton Street. By 1939, the residence was being used as a sergeant's quarters. It had been extended and modified to include veranda rooms, a bathroom, breakfast room and galvanised iron laundry. The building remained in use as the Water Police residence until 1988. A little further north, at 261 to 267 Main Street, is a pair of Georgian-style townhouses known as Silverwells, built by a sea captain in the 1860s. Silverwells consists of 2 mirror-image semi-detached dwellings and is a rare Brisbane example of semi-detached brick housing, a style common in Sydney at the time. The 2 halves were constructed around a central shared chimney stack, which allows for fireplaces in the dining and drawing rooms of each house. The foundations are of Brisbane tough stone, with brick external walls rendered to resemble rough stone. Here it is now. The building was originally known as Mornington, a name changed to Silverwells in 1913. Since that time, it's been tenanted by some of Brisbane's more successful business, legal and political figures. Each dwelling was renovated and restored in the 1960s to 1970s and again in 2010. Next to Silverwells is Sunnyside at 255 Main Street, also known as Dr. Wright's house. Here it is before recent renovations. Sunnyside is a low-set colonial house built in the mid-1890s on land owned by Joseph Thomson, a Sydney businessman who had substantial property assets on Kangaroo Point. He often travelled to his Queen Street business across the river with the harbour master from the Customs House who lived next door at Silverwells. The house was a rental property until acquired by Dr. Robert Wright, a Brisbane dentist, in 1920. It's one of the oldest freestanding houses in Kangaroo Point and is significant as a late 19th century single-storied brick residence. Silverwells and Sunnyside are the last remaining 19th century residences in the block between Scott and Bright Streets. Judy Breedis, great-granddaughter of Dr. Robert Wright, lived in Sunnyside until 2009. When she lived there, she wrote this for us. My great-grandfather was the original Dr. Wright, although whether he operated a practice from here is not known. During his time, the original front gates were made with a sunburst emblem and the house became known as Sunnyside. My grandfather was the second Dr. Wright, an oral surgeon with a practice in Wickham Street in the Valley. He was also the Chilean Consul General and flew the Chilean flag in the front yard as he handled much of his consulate business from his home office. I am writing this article, says Judy, from the same desk and in the same room he used for all those years. We still have some of his consular diaries and a dress medal awarded to him by the Chilean government. We're now back close to the start of our trip at the Storybridge Hotel, perhaps ready for a soothing ale. Thank you for joining me on this tour. Perhaps it has given some insight into how Kangaroo Point has changed so dramatically over what, in comparison to the millennia of Aboriginal habitation, has been the very few years since John Oxley's arrival. Our sincere thanks to all who have contributed to this story. A very good day from me, Austin Adams.